All right, y'all. Hello, welcome to Sankofa Video Books and Cafe. I'm Christina Joy. I'm the events coordinator here. Welcome to our humble abode. This is 2714 Georgia Avenue Northwest. We are directly across from the illustrious Howard University, HU.
You know.
Thank you. Appreciate it. So, we have tonight our lovely guest, Brandi Thomas, who is in conversation with our other humble guest. Oh, he's not really, yes, he be here every day of the week, y'all. He just writes his books. He don't be buying nothing, he just, it's fine. Maybe we can sell one of his books one day, it'll be all right. But,
You better take that back before he not doing his book launch here.
Keep this book off the shelf, okay? So, without further ado, I will allow Derek to talk to Brandi.
I didn't know we were going to start like that. So thank you everybody for coming out. I think you're all excited to hear from Brandi Summers talk about her book, Black in Place, one of the landmark studies of gentrification in Columbia. I'm going to do a quick bio, just so y'all know where she's coming from and what she's doing. Dr. Summers is an associate professor of geography at the University of California, Berkeley. She received her PhD in sociology from the University of California, Santa Cruz, and a master's in social sciences from the University of Chicago. She, of course, is the author, and I'll give you the full title, Black in Place, The Spatial Aesthetics of Race in a Post-Chocolate City, which was published by UNC Press in 2019. And explores aesthetics and race converge to map blackness in Washington, D.C. Just so you know what she's getting into, she is currently working on a book project which explores the roots and routes of Black resistance that laid a foundation for the current effective economies organized to reclaim space through public cultures, politics, and the aesthetics of Black life in her hometown of Oakland, California. And we've got some Oakland folks here this evening. You will excuse us. We have decided to do our own version of drunk history in the case of Dr. Summers. And so hopefully the conversation will get nice and loose by the time we get to the question and answer. If you want to join in, go ahead.
What are you drinking?
We're doing some Glenlivet, and so if anyone wants to join us, the bar is open. And of course, patronize the good folks here at Sankofa. So let me just begin with a question about how you wrote the book, Brandi. So this is, of course, a book about gentrification. Gentrification is a national phenomenon.
Yes.
And you decided to write about it specifically in the district and specifically in the H Street corridor. But you're from Oakland, California, which is a hyper-gentrifying city, just as is the district. And so why D.C.? Why specifically the H Street corridor in D.C. to talk about this thing that's happening nationwide?
So before I answer this question, I want to thank Sankofa Books and Christina for inviting me, and also for Derek. Thank you for agreeing to do this. I'm excited to be back in DC. I was here last year, but prior to that, the pandemic just ruined all travel. And so it's been a while, so I miss it here. So thank you again for having me. And I have such wonderful friends in the audience. I'm very, very happy to see new friends here too. But to answer your question, it's actually practical. I'm super pragmatic. So what happened was I was working on, I knew I was in California where I'm from, and my then husband was sick of California. He said, I want to go back to DC. He's from Southeast, and he wanted to go back home. And I was trying to figure out, all right, how am I going to do this? I need to come up with a project. So I just kind of wrote something for a proposal. So my committee would say, go off and do some research. So I forgot what I wrote about, honestly. So it wasn't until coming here that we drove down H Street. He worked for the DC government, and we put our dry cleaning in at the H Street connection, which is no longer there. And I'm just looking around like, what is this place? Like, the street was different. I noticed Black people on the street, but there was just something cockeyed about it. Like, I just couldn't figure it out. So I started doing some research. I started just pulling up H Street Northeast, Googling it, right? And there was a New York Times article that was saying it was the next up and coming place. And I was like, really? Okay. And then there was a USA Today article that said it was the #6 hippest hipster district in the United States. So I started to realize, okay, well, clearly there's a push or there's some boosters who are trying to make this place a place, right? But I kind of wanted to know what it was before that, because I'd already been, studying, I was a sociologist back then, and I'd already been studying urban transformations, and just specifically, I cared about Black folks. So I was trying to understand Black spaces and how they changed. And so I knew you could feel that it was a Black space. There was a feeling about it that I knew. But if it's in the New York Times and USA Today, I could tell that they were trying to shift what that place was. So it was important for me to find out what was going on. So I started reading a lot about it. But yeah, I think I knew it because I'm from Oakland. I'm from East Oakland, and I knew what it looked like because California had been undergoing that for some time. When I was growing up in the 80s, Oakland felt like a Black city. It was nearly 50% Black. You had Black spaces to congregate, and certainly we were DC. So I really wanted to kind of investigate it. Oh, and then you also asked why H Street. So beyond the practicality of me going to the dry cleaners, I had already read plenty about U Street, about Shaw, and the other component coming from Oakland, which I think is the most extraordinarily ordinary city. And I mean that it's a very working class city. And so oftentimes you don't get people writing books about working class cities unless there's some exceptional figure, some PhD having Black person who led some movement or something like that. And so coming to DC, I appreciated the work that had been done in different areas of DC, but this felt like a very everyday, extraordinarily ordinary part of town. And so I wanted to kind of shine a light on what that meant historically and what was coming about, what was happening, what the future was going to be based on this shift and based on the fact that it was getting national attention.
Mm-hmm. And you forgot that really horrible Atlantic article. Like,
yes.
Used to send those interns here.
That's right.
Yeah, they'd come to the city for like a month and write an article. It'd be terrible.
That's right.
But you should have forgotten. So the book deals wonderfully with the what and the how of gentrification. And so I want to start with the what. I think that many people see April 1968 as this sort of day one in modern DC history. So can you talk about, and you get us there, right, as this sort of generative moment in H Street's history. Can you talk about how the neighborhood changes between 68 and 2019 when the book comes out? So it's sort of that exploration of your early chapters and the what of what you cover.
Sure. I'll start a little bit before that. So what was important also about H Street was specifically in the 50s and 60s. And so prior to that moment that you know and have written about eloquently, H Street was an everyday place where Black people could get their needs met. So basic needs, retail, some commercial. And so because Black folks couldn't shop downtown, there was that barrier. And so H Street was really important to Black everyday life. So it wasn't that necessarily Black folks were treated great there versus going downtown, because there were certainly businesses that were owned by white folks that were still, charging higher prices. It was price gouging. There was all kinds of things happening, as well as discrimination when you walk into a business. You certainly have some profiling that was going on. But at the same time, it was the only place where you could really go and get your needs met. So up until the point when we get to April 4th, 1968, you see the corridors where there was Black life and Black commerce burning. And it wasn't, you have that same narrative. We have this more recently with Ferguson and other locations where the question is, why are they burning their own neighborhoods? It's like they don't own them. Like they don't have real dominion over their spaces. And so they're not necessarily invested in ways that are really meaningful for their lives. And so with H Street, there wasn't the kind of investment and focus on Black life, just like in other areas. while it wasn't necessarily didn't have a political history that, let's say, Shaw and parts of U Street and 14th Street did, it still was really important as it related to small businesses, as it related to, again, everyday life and also residential components. So once the uprisings occurred, though H Street was hit the least in terms of damage, it took the longest to recover. And it became one of those places that mayoral candidates would come around and say, if I win, I'm gonna clean this place up, right? And so they would use it as this, it needed in a lot of ways to be desolate and destitute because they needed to prove that they could make the change. And it didn't necessarily, I mean, clearly it didn't happen, right? The other thing was, there was this understanding that it was a Black space, and there was this important kind of move to, I mean, and Marion Barry was part of this too, where they wanted to build Black spaces by Black people, run these Black spaces for Black people. But you had this coalition of Black, white, and other folks who were trying to say, we need more integrated group of people to really lead changes in the city. And that really negatively affected what was happening on H Street. So there were a lot of different projects that were brought about, development ideas that were brought ahead, but weren't necessarily, they didn't happen, right? And then we have the era of the 80s and 90s, which you're writing about soon and now, where you have the war on essentially drugs, you have the real incarceration of Black men and Black women. And so you start to see where disinvestment also happens. We also have to recognize white flight had occurred in this period, moving up to 68. And so white flight wasn't just white folks running to the suburbs. White folks were courted to the suburbs, and there were financial incentives for them to move to the suburbs, which we weren't afforded those same types of opportunities. So we couldn't have moved to Prince George's County at the time because of restrictive covenants, but then also segregation lasted after the federal end of it, right? So you're starting to see places like H Street start to fall down, not because there weren't people who didn't care about it. There were still people who lived there. And you start to see, like, if you start reading articles in the Washington Post, they'd act like nobody was there. There were people living there. There were families living there. There were people trying to make it. It's just it wasn't getting the attention and the love that it needed. So as we're moving forward, you start to see redevelopment and reinvestment start to happen once we have this kind of shift, how capitalism works, right? Neoliberal capitalism. This way that there was this emphasis on private investments, this emphasis of moving away from public investment and public resources for people, really antagonizing the poor, really hating the working class. And that's ultimately what it ended up being, right? There was more of a focus on creating entrepreneurial subjects who were middle class and above. And so in order to do that, you had to ostracize those who were in need of care. And so that was happening for government were actually really supportive of working class people, right? But when you again alienate those kinds of social services, it creates this big difference between the haves and the have-nots. At the same time, we have books like Natalie Hopkinson's book, who were talking about the influence of go-go, where there were go-go outlets on H Street. You started to see the culture was still there, but it didn't seem to have the heart because so much of it had been completely torn apart. Moving forward, just to be quick, like imagining kind of how gentrification starts to come in, you start to see not only disinvestment, but a kind of reinvestment that focuses on entertainment rather than the actual needs of the city.
Oh, wait, hold on. Yeah, let me. No, because I want to ask this, because
okay.
So one of the things that you said is really fascinating to me, and I encountered this in my own research, which is that post 68, everybody wants to reinvest in these riot corridors, quote unquote, right? And H Street is one of them. So the Barry administration puts money into offices there, right? Radio 1 opens up a studio there, and you actually have that huge window where people are walking by
and see them,
and it's supposed to like on the radio, right? And so there's Black people attempting to rebuild these riot corridors as Black-owned spaces, right? So there's an effort, right? And there's working class Black people living all around here, right? I mean, there's that horrible murder of the woman who was going to the store.
Yes, and they arrested 6 to 8 young men.
But she was a working class lady going to a working class business around the corner after work, right? Like it's a functioning neighborhood. that's the 80s,
Yes.
right? And then you get all of this reporting
Mm-hmm.
in the 90s. Well, you still see it now, right? Where folks say it was a hollowed out mess and nobody lived there,
That's
quote
right.
unquote. It always ends with nobody lived
That's
there, right? Vacation. So starting really in 2000 and leading up until the end of the book, which is how people justify gentrification, and how do people, and how does the city, including black city officials, and we got to talk about that in a subsequent question, so we'll pin that, right? How do they actually make gentrification happen that in a way that people walk away from those earlier development projects that were supposed to be black-led, supposed to lead to black ownership, into a situation where the strip just whitewashes. You know, you get all this city money flooding in, but when the dust clears, white folks are living in the neighborhoods, white folks are owning the businesses, and black folks are somewhere else. So can you talk about that how?
Yeah, well, I want to be clear though that H Street didn't have that kind of flip like that, right? It was really complicated in how when black people were in and out, like black folks were still there. And so that's what I was noticing once I got here. You still saw black people, like they were here. It's just that you start to see certain kinds of white folks moving in. So you'd see young white couples whose parents helped them with the down payment and they only planned to live there until they got pregnant and then they would move to Northern Virginia. And so for a while that meant that they weren't trying to transition to schools because they didn't have kids. So it wasn't until they started having children that they wanted to take back the schools, right? So this story of gentrification, it didn't look like U Street. Like it wasn't exactly the same. And I think because of it being a place where it was more of a service economy, it wasn't more entertainment. What happened was, so there's a couple of things here. When we think about gentrification, sometimes people only think about it as related to residential shifts, right? I was looking more at the commercial elements because I felt like the residential component was important. I go shopping, like when you gotta go somewhere, that's what we are. I don't know who's in somebody's house, but I do know who's on the street walking around and who's in different businesses. And so that mattered to me, what it felt like to be black in this corridor. And so what you started to see as it related to gentrification and how the government was contributing to it, it was more so rebranding. It was strategic plans through the Office of Planning, where they wanted to cut it up in three areas. There's a residential component, there's the entertainment component, and then there's like the needs or whatever kind of service needs that you had, right? And so by branding it in that way and putting, for example, a Main Streets designation there, right? This was the first Main Street that was outside. Main Streets programs are not supposed to be in major cities. They're supposed to be kind of in towns, right? It's to bring about a kind of Americana where people kind of can shop and walk. Sorry.
And by the way, do folks in the audience know what Main Streets
Yes,
are?
sorry.
The program, the Main Streets? Is there, like, when folks like explain?
Okay,
Okay,
yeah,
yeah.
so the Main Streets program it's based out of the DC Department of Small and Local Business Development. And it's with the National Historic Preservation Office, which is a federal program or is federally funded. And essentially they give funds to redevelop corridors to have them be commercial or they're generally commercial corridors. They support changes to the built environment, they changes to lights, changes to the facade of the business. It's a way to encourage the kinds of activities like festivals, and it makes you want to feel like you're in a small town. And so that's why it seemed really odd to have it in a place like DC. And there are several Main Streets corridors in DC. 8th Street is a Main Street. I feel like Shaw is a Main Street. They were trying to open in Pennsylvania, which makes no sense whatsoever. But they're trying to designate these locations to bring in attention, to brand it essentially and have people come and shop, have tourists come. And so to make this corridor a Main Street, the intention was to say, this is how we're gonna get folks to this area again, because it was a major shopping corridor. So what happens with gentrification is the city has to tell particular narratives of a place. They have to create an imaginary place in a lot of ways to get people to come. And so one of the imaginary ways that they recreated H Street was to say its heyday was when the streetcar was there. And it just so happened that the streetcar ended the year that Black folks became a majority in the community by chance. And also, you start to see the ways that it tries to harken back to the heyday. And so that's when they start focusing on historic preservation. You'll start to see the alcohol and beverage folks coming in and determining which locations can have alcohol and beverages or alcoholic beverages. You start to see them making decisions about what types of businesses can be there. So again, there were so many barbershops and beauty shops on H Street. Those were small Black businesses that supported the community. So there was, I talk about it, I think, in the introduction. I haven't read my book again. So there was the Deputy Mayor for Planning and Economic Development had Tommy Wells at the time was the city council member for the area, and he had put forward a bill essentially saying that certain businesses could get money for improving the facade, right? Well, they excluded barbershops and beauty shops, but they included nail shops. And so it was this weird, supposedly, they overlooked it, so it included restaurants and all these other things, right? So of course, there's a big uproar because who owns barbershops and beauty shops, especially on A Street, but Black folks, right? So it's clearly this way that you're not having an opportunity to expand the quality of your business, to encourage people to come in. And barbershops and beauty shops are bringing in more revenue than any other retail establishments on the corridor. So you can't make the argument that, well, we're trying to improve the corridor by bringing more money-making businesses because that was already there. So you start to see that kind of language being used to shift what it looks like rather than actual money. And so gentrification is complicated because it's one of those terms that people use, it's a catch-all. You just see white folks coming as gentrification. But no, there are some real structural elements that contribute to it that the government plays into. The other element is they start giving incentives to developers to come in and essentially wipe out a lot of the buildings that were there. H Street Connection is now, I think, a VEC. So they start to encourage mixed use buildings where you have business on the bottom and condos or apartments on the top. What you start to notice though is that where there used to be 3-bedroom and 4-bedroom apartments for families, now it's only studio, 1-bedroom and 2-bedroom. So they're not big, so you're not trying to encourage families, but they don't explicitly say they're not trying to encourage families. All they gotta do is have tiny little holes for folks who work on the Hill who plan to leave and go to Virginia. So thinking about gentrification as this longer process, as something that is, to me, is inherently racialized. It has everything to do with Black folks. And you know it when you see it. And so I needed to be able to tell an academic audience that we can't overlook this, that Black people are central to this change and this dynamic. And so the how and what it looks like was what mattered to me. I wanted to be able to explain why is it that when I walk down H Street, I feel a certain kind of way? I feel like people aren't talking to each other. Like I see Black people, but they're not going inside the businesses. I see white folks, but they're not talking to the dude in front of Popeyes. And why is there a Popeyes here? Like I was trying to understand, there's a Chinese carryout. I was like, what are they doing by putting restaurants that are $20 a plate and then Popeyes right next to it? So just trying to understand what they were doing was really important to me for this.
So I have to ask you about this, I think this fabulous term that you use in the book called Black aesthetic emplacement, because it just so perfectly encapsulates how walking up and down the street, Blackness is everywhere. Everywhere. Right? I mean, it's literally everywhere. There's a New Orleans themed restaurant. Yes. There's Granville Moore's, which is named after an African American doctor, which was an oyster bar or something, right? Yeah. Like Blackness is everywhere, and Black folks own nothing. Right? Except the dying businesses. And so can you just talk about sort of how that comes out of city policy?
Absolutely. So, one thing, and we can talk about, there's some limitations to my book, so I'll wait on that. We can talk about that later. But that's right. You start to see, or at least I started to see, it felt like a Black place, it was gutted though. So, and you walk around DC in so many different places where it's like, I'll see a Black face on a wall, but only white patrons. Right. And so I don't feel good. I don't feel like I belong here just because there's a Black face on a wall. And so you'd hear Black music. I hear hip hop as I'm walking down the street and I'm looking and I'm like, oh, that's a sushi bar with some frat boys and that's not for me. So you start to see that on H Street a lot, and it has a lot to do not just with like Black History Month, but then the other thing was there was a mural at the end in the Starburst Plaza of H Street, and they had Marian Anderson, Martin Luther King, of course. I'm trying to think who the last person was, I'm forgetting right now. But they tried to have this mix of local and national Black history. And so it was a way to, again, draw in their commitment to recognizing the history matters and it's a place-making process. But they weren't necessarily including Black folks. So Black aesthetic and placement, my students call it BAE. BAE allows me to kind of think about how Blackness still matters, but under certain conditions. Blackness only matters to bring people who aren't Black into the city. Blackness matters to say, well, we got a Black looking place, but it doesn't matter that we're evicting Black people and having them move out of the city. So it was actually an effective device to get Black people out without seeming, they didn't seem overly racist, right? Like, I commit to Black stuff. I'm naming my business after a Black person. So that means I'm committed to this history. Just I don't want Black folks in my establishment. So it was very to see the nuance and to see it happening, it was scary. And that's what I could recognize in Oakland. It was certainly in Oakland. The Black Panthers are everywhere, but they certainly don't want anybody with the politics of the Black Panther Party. So they're happy to have symbolism. And we can go into your lovely mayor.
So let's go into this. So I'll tell you all a story. I don't think Beverly Perry's here, right? So you know the mayor's consigliere is Beverly Perry, and I'll never forget. I was doing an interview somewhere, and I basically said, like, you know, the mayor's lorded over, like, pushing tons of Black people out of the city. Yeah. Beverly Perry called me at home. And she's like, don't ever say that the mayor don't like no Black people.
Oh, stop.
Right? And I think that underscores something that you point out, which is that everything you just mentioned has happened under a Black mayor, not just Muriel Bowser, like several Black
every mayor in DC has been.
And for most of the time at least, because we had a moment, a majority Black council. Right?
That's right.
And so that begs a really stupid question, right? For its obviousness, which is, how has that happened?
Yeah.
Because these folks would swear to you up and down, and I almost believe them, right? That they don't hate no Black folks.
Okay.
Right? And so how do you get a Black mayor and a majority Black council who are crafting policy that is actively driving hyper-gentrification in their city? How does that happen?
I don't think they hate Black people, I think they hate poor Black people. So I think there's when we think about DC and knowing that there's a strong Black middle class and one of the largest Black middle classes that has existed over time, it's a stable economy. The federal government has kept this place between, you know, contracts and all those different opportunities for Black folks to build Black middle class and Black upper middle class communities, 16th Street and like all those folks, right? So with the mayors and multiple mayors, because we can also go back to Anthony Williams and talk a little bit about Anthony Williams in the book, because his charge to bring 100,000 people to the city ended up doing a lot of the damage and kicking Black folks out. And the intention, I don't believe he wanted Black folks to leave, but he also had the pressure from the federal government essentially saying that DC is incompetent and y'all can't balance your budget. And so that he needed to encourage more people to the city to bring about this kind of growth, economic growth, right? So the impact, and so then after him, I mean, there were a number of mayors, they're really neoliberal mayors. Like they're the folks who really focus on entrepreneurialism or at least kind of a larger private investment or at least private companies, corporations coming in and expanding their reach. And so how it happens under Black mayors is a shift, again, hating poor Black people. I think that's really the bottom line. And that's what I would say, that's the limit of my book. I don't go into class enough in the book. And I don't really go into the nuances because I think I was overwhelmed by seeing Blackness everywhere, but not a love of Black people. So it was like, oh, that's another book if I focus on Black, like class relations. So, you know, in particular, I remember when I was still living here, there was an interview that Muriel Bowser did where she was talking about her role. It was her first term, and she was talking about her role as mayor being being one who was supposed to focus on economic development as her primary role as mayor. And I'm looking and I'm like, you felt like it was okay to say that, like with your whole chest, like that is your job, to expand the economic base, but not necessarily be there for people. So as I see it, she's doing a wonderful job, like, because it has nothing to do with the people, it has everything to do with bringing in money, and at the same time, that doesn't support what Black folks are doing here. And so again, when I was talking about the service economy that existed on 8th Street, nowadays, we don't really have the same kind of emphasis on a service economy. We got Amazon, we got, Jeff Bezos not paying taxes. We have all of these billionaires who are roaming around here who don't necessarily have to take care or think about the kinds of work that people are doing here. And they're consolidating. And it's not being supported necessarily because it's like rich Black folks want to stay rich. And ultimately, a capitalist wants to keep reproducing wealth. They're not thinking about the proletariat. They're not thinking about the workers. They're thinking about reproducing and exploiting. So in a lot of ways, it doesn't matter what color their skin is as it relates to poor Black folks. White and Black rich folks hate poor Black people. And I said it and I mean it. Like, that is just everything, every policy that comes about, it's the same thing. And you start to see also where there's still this focus, even with the city council, it's not unlike other cities. So DC is not unique in this regard. Like, you start to see ways that people are trying to have power and influence. Whether that's, and Barry got in trouble for hiring all his people, right? And so that's why a lot of white folks hated him, because he was hiring his people. He was giving contracts to his people. He was having them run agencies, right? But at the same time, the job program, the summer jobs program was the best thing in people's lives. So they want to bash him, but he's done a lot for Black people and working class Black people. So I'm not mad at that. I think there are a lot of ways that he was set up, and there are a lot of ways that he was vilified, but
another conversation.
That's another conversation.
Yes.
But I do think it's important to recognize how class plays a huge, huge part in this. And so that's how Black mayors can be in charge of this kind of work that's being done, essentially. Yeah.
I'm gonna be respectful of the time, and I want to make sure that you all get your questions in. So I'm gonna ask my last one here. I have more, but I want to make sure that the folks can talk to you and you can talk to the folks. Mm-hmm. So this is, to a degree, a very depressing story, right? And so let's sort of try to flip it on the last question and ask, what can folks do about this? Because look, there's some real chinks in the armor here, right? Because developers and the city government are using Black history to sell the city to rich people, right? And in the process, gentrifying it. There's a little bit of space there for folks to jump in and say, whether they be sociologists or historians or folks on the street, to say, no, this is ours, right? Y'all talking about Chocolate City, you talking about 8th Street, you talking about Granville Moore. We need to make sure that you cut us in or cut it out, right? So can you talk about what's possible considering what you found on 8th Street?
Yeah. So this often, because I was trained as a sociologist, we are inherently depressive and depressing. We deal with problems. So it's funny because I had a review on some website where basically the guy was complaining that I didn't give enough solutions to the problems. I'm like, that's not my job.
Yeah.
But what I do think is this really had me think more meaningfully about local community-based power and politics. And that so often you see the national news cycle having us focus on what's going on, even though it might be based in DC because the federal government's here. But we are looking up too much. We're focused on that crazy orange dude. We're focused on what's going on in Florida. And that's fine for entertainment to a certain extent, but we really need to focus on what's going on here. So it has a lot to do with you. I'm not one of those rah-rah vote people at all. However, as it relates to local elections, as it relates to your ANCs in particular, not just your city council members, but the ANC representatives have enormous power and they're able to dictate so much. And so it is important that you pay attention to what they're doing, whether it's you getting newsletters or you contacting them, being a pain in the ass, like all of that, do it. Because part of it, I think, part of the story of gentrification and why it's so effective is because it creates individuals. It does not produce or encourage community. And that's how we survived. Like we adapt because our survival is because of community. So we have to figure out how to get back together. The other problem and effectiveness of gentrification is it breaks us up. So we don't live in the same communities anymore. So it takes more effort. We've seen what happened to the churches. We've seen what's happened to parking along the churches. And so part of the book is me focusing on the very mundane and everyday ways that we're pulled apart, right? So it's gonna take effort for us to come back together and create community. And as that power block, I do think that there's influence that can be done. So it's to ignore, I guess, what's going on outside and to instead consolidate your energy and power inside and with your people that you trust. And seriously, they have to care about poor and working class Black people. Even if you're not poor or working class, you still gotta care about them, right? Because literally, if you support them, you are good. Like, it really does move up. So that would be my thing. Like, when there's opportunities for generational wealth that a lot of folks are focused on, keep in mind that it's generation, like it's the community. It is not just your family. You really do need to account for the people that your children are gonna be around, that your grandchildren are gonna be around. That is how Black folks operate. And so I think a lot of the ways that these cities are being run and this growth strategy is to have us forget that and forget spaces. That's the last thing I'll say. I wrote an article about what was going on with Dope Me in DC and like thinking about like what it means to have Black people in place, literally. And part of it, the power I think of the Don't Meet DC movement was just having Black people on the street. Like it was I was still here then. So like we were undeniable. Like we stopped traffic. Like you can't move without us being in place. And so whether that's literal or figurative, we need to still be here and come back here. And it really, I think it's more powerful than we think, and not listen to kind of the words, the rhetoric that's going on in the national news.
Thank you. I'm assuming that folks that want to ask questions need a microphone. And so please don't snatch the mic, and please don't take too long with the mic. Please go ahead. You can do a little speech, you're fine, but not too much. Ask a question, and then we'll make sure that we get everybody in. So thank you so much for in advance. It looks like we have two in the back.
Hi, my grandfather owned a house at 816 8th Street.
Wow. Oh, 8th and H. Wow.
Correct.
Yeah.
So I went to Ludlow Teller, and then I realized that one of EQ's alumni became a mayor, and he shut down the Children's Museum.
Yeah.
And I told my mother we should move because of that. And we did. We moved to Southeast, and we never made our way back to Uptown again. But that was, I didn't know if I haven't had a chance to read your book, but it was that one of the things that you saw that once they moved the Children's Museum, the only one that was in DC.
Right.
Did you read?
I did know that they turned it into condos, right?
Condos.
Yes, and so, you know, it was before a children's museum, it was like a children's home, like it was a home for poor children before that. So to turn it into really like a luxury condo or apartment space, yeah, and it was huge, it was massive. So it
also options for a second charter school.
I don't know
Okay.
that's in location.
I think options went in and then it became.
I don't think I realized that.
Okay.
So
I might be making that up. My apologies.
They turned it directly to condos.
Okay.
Yeah, and so that's at the base of H Street, right? Like where the bridge is. So yeah, I looked into that because it was a huge building. I was curious about it, so I would just walk up and down the street all the time.
I walk you through it.
Okay. Yeah. So that kind of thing matters, right? Because there's that argument that we need more housing. We don't need more housing. We need more affordable housing. So we already have enough housing. it's what's affordable. And so to make it these places that ended up being the cookie cutter apartments, essentially, that were condos, that was the beginning. That was the beginning of that real shift. So yes, thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
Hello. Okay, two things, well, three things. When you were discussing the Black aesthetics, I think the role of banks or other institutions when they come into the city is interesting because they often try to contract Black artists or local
Yes, they do.
programs and then use that within the installations
They do.
for the work. So with each outpost or photo, it's kind of like a colonial mindset, but they use the artist or the local communal language as a camouflage for the work.
Yep.
And on the aspect of class, I remember talking with an elder who was around for much of Barry's era and that communal shift. He discussed how when the Black middle class gained enough wealth and there was kind of too close a proximity with poorer or economically disenfranchised Black people, that there was a desire to move to places like, PG County or Potomac, Maryland.
Yeah.
And he said that was ultimately a fatal flaw within the power structure in the city. Because in moving outward and away from that, divorcing themselves, they wound up ceding power to other entities or forces coming into the city. And then the third question is really, this is a question.
Okay.
The role of, Black people in the community as stakeholders for their cultural development, but also for their community enrichment. What role as stakeholders can they do to kind of balance the power dynamic that's ultimately been shifted with all this economic interest?
Thank you for that question and also that observations. And yes, you're right. Not only banks, but other, like even the condo buildings, they have they hire Black artists, and the issue is that they tell them what they can and can't paint put up there, so they don't get to put whatever they want up there too. JBG, there's a few other developers that have been doing that a lot. And then yes, as it relates again to class, what's also important to consider is that I think there are some stories about gentrification, just movement generally, that presume displacement is literally kicking people out, but that's not necessarily always what happens. It's also folks went to Prince George's County because there was space, like they couldn't live there before. So there was an opportunity to have a home and a yard and so it's not a bad thing. Black folks like nice stuff too. Like it's not like we didn't. It's just that there was an investment in these spaces, specifically in DC. So you go where there's trees, you go where there's there's beauty, right? So it makes a lot of sense, but still there does have to be this kind of commitment to the city. And you saw that still culturally and spiritually with people still coming back to DC and going to church, right? Even if they lived in Prince George's County. But as it relates to stakeholders, I think what matters is that we don't separate cultural, economic, political. I think they all kind of go together, and they have always for Black folks. So if you so I don't actually know that you can break that apart. And that doesn't mean the economic focus is that everyone's trying to get rich. It's just, we're just trying to live. So if you don't have this attitude that you need to be wealthy and have more than what you need to enjoy your life, then we can't talk. I don't know how to reason with someone like that, right? And especially as you're thinking about elders, it's you want to be able to provide care. You want what happened, let's say at the Arthur Capper homes, to not happen, where it's folks get kicked out and then can't move back, but the elders can't have some next door neighbor go to the pharmacy and get them their prescription anymore. That's what we want to avoid. So in terms of stakeholders, we all kind of have to be stakeholders. So it's a commitment to the neighborhood. So it's I guess it's transitioning your role as a resident or a homeowner or a tenant, because this is the home of the Tenants Opportunity to Purchase Act, which is really important and is having a lot of influence on my home state right now. They're trying to be like DC, enabling tenants to purchase their buildings. That in itself is building a kind of stakeholder role that you must invest your sweat equity into your community, not just your dollars, not just like yourself. So I see them all coming together or being together.
Hey, my name is Fia, and I'm here from another working class city, right, from Philadelphia, right, with a long black weird history, right, of loss. We're like, where's Sound of Philadelphia? Where is it, right? Who knows? So I have a rack of questions. I'm not going to ask them all at all, but I want to go through them a little bit, right? As a black landlord now at Broad and Olney, I find myself in my darkest moments praying for a Starbucks, right? Because my niece lives downstairs and my boy's son lives upstairs, and there are bullets flying everywhere, right? But it's a question for me. It's like when somebody asks, like, how can we contribute? Right. At the same time, I find myself in fear, asking for gentrification. Right? It's scary. I wonder about any cities you see mastering this reinvestment in a good way. I'm gonna skip that, right? I wonder about if the past is so erased, like Northeast, how do we connect young people to that past anymore? Do they not, if they've never seen the example of a chocolate city before, what do we do next, right? But I'm gonna skip that, because I know you're not about what do we do next, right? I'm also curious about non-black-white relations, like Northeast Philadelphia. There's mostly Russian, but it's now seeing an influx of Latino and black low income, right? That kind of thing. Or Philadelphia's the Italian market, right, that is now mostly sort of Korean, and how you've seen this kind of thing parallel across other cultures. I'm gonna skip that one. I'm not gonna talk about Watts, where I lived right in LA for 3 years, and how I saw Watts used to be black and now is 80% Latino. What's going on there? I'm very curious. We can talk about that later. Or Harlem, right? When I moved to New York, I lived in New York for 6 years. How goofy I felt. Coming from Philly, like, wait till I get to 125th. I'm gonna see Black Mecca, wait till I see it. And then what I saw, I'm very curious about what you're seeing in New York, but we're just gonna sit that. I'm gonna ask you about an academic question, which is, did your research allow you to see this equation in advance in any other cities? Do you see other cities? Do you see other cities on this path that A Street Northeast is going through? Can you identify it at different stages?
Thank you, Fia. I've known Fia since I was 17, so yes. I'm not answering all those questions. Yeah. No, the first one was it. The first one was good. Now I'm trying to remember. Oh, Philly landlord. Okay. So yeah, and I think you're not alone. I think a lot of people feel that way. And also not just as a landlord, as someone living in a city, you want to be safe. But the answer isn't to become a capitalist. Like, I think it's often the idea is, well, if I can just make more money and move somewhere else, then it'll be better. And that's not the answer. So I think part of it is letting go of what that means. Being a landlord generally is supposed to be bad, but I get it. You know, it's just not a job. As long as you recognize that being a landlord is not a job, that you don't deserve something, I think you're okay. As long as you're recognizing that you're providing shelter at a reasonable price to someone to live, then we can work through it. But it is not a job. And I think so often landlords believe they are owed because they have property and they're letting someone stay there. You aren't working, sir, ma'am. Like no. So part of it though is recognizing that it's not your tenants. It's honestly not the people shooting through the windows and stuff. It is this lack of investment. It's not the police. It's not a need for more police. This is the whole point about talking about the role of cities and what they are and aren't doing. It's a way that they let areas start to decay in order to justify taking over them. So part of it still is an investment in that community. How stark the wealth gap is it really, it feels like we're living in the 80s all over again. Like you start to really see that there's no public spaces for people to be. There's no community spaces. There's no, we can't hang out anymore. There's not resources. Nothing's affordable. That's what actually has healthy communities is when you have jobs for folks, for kids, when you got things for them to do, you got sports, when they're safe, when there's grass, when there's trees, they done knock down all the trees, it's hot, like you don't want to be outside. It's investing in the entire community that matters. So yeah, as a landlord, yes, it's tough, I'm sorry, but it's not their fault, right? it's so much has to do with a lack of investment in the full community, and recognizing that means as a landlord, as a property owner, you should be yelling at your city council in Philly. You should be talking to the mayor. You should be talking to all these people and having them not give set-asides to all these developers to create what they tried to do for H Street, creating these same. You see the architecture is the same. You go to any city, it looks the same everywhere. It doesn't. You don't recognize it as a unique space anymore. And that doesn't mean you have to do Victorian restoration. You don't have to do that either. You just need to still kind of draw on the culture of the area. Okay, quickly, the last thing you said about whether you can kind of see this in other cities. Part of it has to do with this urban / whatever, suburban, rural, like these designations where you start to see the emphasis is growth. And whenever you see places trying to grow, they lean on the same kind of framework, which is expanding opportunities for investment, building new houses. But we're gonna start to look like other countries. Like in China, they got ghost towns. Like they got buildings that are empty and have no one in them. And it's just, they tore down forests and stuff in order to build homes that no one's moving into. So in a lot of ways, there's talks of like 15-minute cities where you want to be able to walk, but who gets to walk? Like a lot of rich white people can walk to work and walk to the store, but how do you create opportunities for everyone to be able to live? So in I guess predicting the future, I think we've saturated it. I think COVID showed us a lot. It showed us the bottom, but it's still a cycle. I believe time is a cycle. I don't think there's anything new. I think everything is just kind of recreating itself. So no, I'm not seeing in the next city, like Cincinnati. I mean, actually it's happening in Cincinnati too. But like, if there's not a particular city where I'm like, oh, this is right for that next thing. There are barriers. I can talk about why Baltimore hasn't become DC, like in the same way. We can talk about that. But a lot of it.
Should we talk about
No.
Me for Baltimore, I don't think we should.
No, we should talk about that again. That's another book and another conversation. But you can see the reasons why Detroit hasn't become DC, right? There are reasons, and that has so much to do with these elements that I do talk about in the book that aren't just limited to DC, but have to do with how we understand cities, how we understand political infrastructure, how we understand the federal government investing in tearing down neighborhoods to build a freeway, how, all those different things play into what's happening today, despite it being 50, 60 years ago. So thank you for the question.
Hello, Brandi, I love you. We'll talk later. What you said about the murals, that struck a chord with me. I own a condo in Southeast. I have a business right here on 7th Street. So when I drive in, I see the difference. And I see these beautiful murals, beautifully done, of Black people that live where my business is, but I don't see Black people. I signed the lease in 2010 and it looked very different. Right here in Shaw, it looks very different than what it does now. Aside from me holding the town halls, and I own a salon, but aside from me holding the town halls and the salons and IG lives and what is DC doing? What is Muriel doing? I feel like, okay, that's not enough. Like and this is not a question of, Brandi, what do I do? But just a suggestion, like when I feel like, pardon my friend, like this shit isn't enough. Like, do we just take it and make steps for the next generation? But like what can we do at this point when it's just like, I don't need to see another brewery. I drink beer. I don't need to see another coffee shop, but like everybody else gets the opportunities, but not us.
Right. Thank you, Ashley. Yeah, so, it's what I think is important is that you don't discount holding the town halls at the salon. I think you definitely should continue to do that. At the same time, I want you all to also recognize there are people who are organizing in this city and really pushing for folks to make change. And so oftentimes it's making space for the folks who are doing that hard work. So because you run a business, you can invite them into your space to host something or to hold something in different communities. Like there are people doing the work. There are people who have been fighting this for a long time. I think so often they talk to each other because they're not able to reach you all. They're not able to reach some of the business owners and et cetera. So in a lot of ways, it's you recognizing what you can do and what your role is in the city and being able to reach out to people who are doing different kinds of work. I think about it oftentimes as like with academics, like I don't have expertise in some areas, so I'm gonna pull somebody from that expertise in that area and work with them to do, because I can't get to this point without them. So if you want a different outcome and you know that you're stretched because you're running your own business, then you want to figure out, okay, what are the ways I can help? I know there are people who are doing this work. How do I reach out to them? How can I be of service to them? Do I need to have a fundraiser for them? Do I need to host something? Do I need to, and even with the beauty of the murals, I think they're beautiful too. I mean, there's a Neocon has done so many of these murals around U Street and 14th or whatever, Ben's Chili Bowl, like he did all those, right? I love seeing Black faces. It's just, you can do both. Like you can keep Black people in the city and also paint Black folks everywhere. So if as we're thinking about it too, it's like, organizing works, so it always has, and I think we've gotten too far away from that in the ways that we've tried to raise money and make our family safe without considering the people around us as family. So do that work still, but invite others into your circle and see what ways you can contribute and help. And I think that you won't perhaps feel as frustrated about it, but it's incremental sometimes.
And I know Nakoshi has the next question and brother here as well. Can you talk really quickly though about sort of a concrete individual that was working in that way on 8th Street, which is brothers Abdul Salim Anwar Salim. Can you talk about sort of how he interacted with the city in the midst of this? Because as I understand it, there was organizing among Black businesses on 8th Street that tried to push back against some of these policies. And that organizing to a significant degree failed, right? And so can you talk about his experience and what happened? Yeah, I'll get you another.
So the challenge, in the book, and I haven't talked to Anwar since the book was published, because I called him an ideal neoliberal subject. Essentially, he was trying to teach Black businesses, to tell them to go to Georgetown and learn how to be like good, strong businesses to be successful. He was as the executive director, maybe, I don't know if he is still, of the Main Street on 8th Street. And so he did the festival. The festival's fun, it's great, and he wanted to he's a booster, like he wants to bring a lot of attention. But at the same time, he also wants developers to come in and build. And so that wasn't necessarily what was needed. He's from the area. One of his friends died in the uprisings and the fire. He owned beauty shops along the corridor. So he's committed. So this is not me shading him in any way. At the same time, money got a hook, and it was like, he was more focused on developing and being successful through that enterprise rather than actually thinking about, wait, let's pause for a second and figure out what's going on here. I still think organizing works. It's not maybe the businesses in terms of what they were up against didn't, because he wanted them to look a different way. Like he wanted them to contort themselves to be more successful based on how white businesses had been successful. And that is not the way. So we Black folks organize and have organized successfully. We push against, I think, we'll go for a more digestible idea of what politics looks like and organizing looks like in a integrationist kind of way when some of the radicals push to the side. So if you aren't comfortable being radical, then sprinkle a little bit on it and then work with somebody who is radical in order to actually push it forward. But at this point, it's so extreme right now that I don't think we can do anything but be radical. Like it's so extreme. Like seeing the unhoused population and the sweeps, what's happening in Northeast DC. I'm just going around various circles and seeing that there are tents on federal land But there are a ton of unhoused people here. And I'm in the land of the unhoused. So it's like, I see it every day. But to come here and see it too, I was shocked. So it's not that people are necessarily have mental health crises or they're not getting support either. But also it's families that are on the street and they won't account for children who are on the street because that will make the city look bad. So they won't necessarily count how many impoverished children there are in this city. There's no white poverty in DC. There hasn't been for years. Like literally it's zero. So to keep in mind that it's Black folks that are suffering the most. So I still say it's still important. So though Anwar, and I know he probably, if he read the book, he wouldn't talk to me afterwards, but it was important, I thought, to be very clear about someone who has good intentions doesn't always have a good outcome based on what they're doing.
Ooh, mic drop, my God.
I was wondering, as someone unfamiliar with DC geography, and anticipating your next book about Oakland, I was wondering if you could speak to similarities and differences that you see, and the way that you speak about H Street. I've never been there, but it reminds me of East 14th in Oakland. Forgive me if I'm wrong, but I'm wondering if you could explain that, and whatever other similarities, including Tent City, for the unhoused that you see.
Thank you, Antoine. So yes, my next book is on Oakland. I need to write it. But part of it is the way I was able to write about DC was that it was an adopted home. It wasn't my home, so I could distance myself from it. So it's harder to write about your home. And though I was able to recognize what was going on here because of my own experiences in Oakland and growing up there and, the migration story that occurred. My family comes from Louisiana, so we go to San Francisco, then to Oakland, and then they're still there. So understanding, those similarities and recognizing the disappearance of Black people, but the mainstay of like Blackness in the city was really something that I recognized in California too. And so H Street's not like East 14th, and I appreciate you calling it East 14th because it changed its name to International Boulevard, and I still like if somebody says International Boulevard, I want to
It's giving Noma.
Yeah, yes, exactly. It's rebranding, right? And so I don't know what International Boulevard is. So, but it was a place. There's a way. California. And specifically thinking about East Oakland and East 14th, especially through East Oakland. There, we would go and get our tamales and our tortillas on that street, right? So there was a large Mexican American population there, but at the same time, there were a lot of Black joints there that you go to a bar, barbecue places, whatever. And so it's not exactly the same, but there are elements that are similar because it was that everyday space that people will go and buy stuff, right? Is where you get your food, is where you can kind of hang out, right? The Fremont's not far. Fremont High School was nearby, so you knew where my daddy went to Fremont. It's like you knew East Oakland in that place. DC and Oakland are so different but so similar, and so it's hard to really account for where they break up. But at the same time, recognizing the significance of Black power and the Black power rhetoric that was able to move the needle in both places, I think is where they come together. And I think that's where we need to come back to because Oakland is suffering. Black population's at 20% now. And so it went from 49% to 20%. And so, yeah, it's dramatic and you feel it. And so and you told me that now with the census that white folks have now flipped and now are the majority in DC. I didn't know that. So there is a trend. It's gonna happen. We have to.
To be clear, the plurality. So
but still, that's significant.
49% white, 45.8% white.
That's still that they've overtaken, right? So it's significant though, and it will speak to how it feels here. So the numbers may say one thing, but then the feeling comes. So don't ignore your feeling. Don't ignore, what's in your gut about what is happening, even if the data doesn't represent what's, you're feeling. Still act on that. So that's why it's important, I think, for me. I still haven't figured out how to write my own story into the Oakland book, and so that's why I'm struggling with it. I can write about the academic stuff easily and the data stuff easily, but I can't put myself, because I have a lot of trauma coming from Oakland, and I still live through it. And it's hard to write about. It's hard to write about my family and what was happening back then. The 80s were a tough time. So, in a murder capital, you know what I mean? So DC and Oakland were very similar in that way. And I wanted to escape. I left at 17 because I was like, I can't, if I don't leave now, I'm never gonna leave. And so, but I have a love, we were talking about this earlier, once you leave, you really rediscovered your love of your home. And so I love Oakland with all my heart, but like, the Oakland of my youth is not the Oakland today. And I'm having a really hard time reconciling that and figuring out how to think with it. And so I thought coming to DC, I'd feel like, oh, okay, ooh, chocolate city, whatever. And I'm starting to see.
Professors Dedrick and Brandi Thompson Summers, thank you for sharing with us. I would also like to say that I'm looking at the doers in this city. I'm looking at the United House of Prayer for All People with over 350 housing for their people over the last 30 to 40 years. There's something in the fertilizer of people who do and have done. I'm looking at the fertilizer of Lightfoot Solomon Mashal and Mary Eliza Pauline Mashal. Howard University, just about a month and a half ago, maybe 2 months, did something with their architectural department with Albert Cassell and the Mayfair Mansion. And those of us know that there was a deal in between Mashal with his resources, and not just his financial resources, but to provide housing. There's Bethel Baptist Church that's near Anacostia that's building something there that's First and Brandywine Southeast with Southeast Tabernacle Baptist Church. Though it's in the ground on the blueprint, how do we look at those people, whether they're in that particular communal environment, because this is a communal environment? How do we pull greater from the communal environment that do, have done, did, and shall continue to do, rather than looking at those who have no intentions to do, but they are to continue with their, excuse the expression, their talented tent vampirism.
That's right.
Can I add to that? Because by studying 8th Street, you end up studying a specific place that gentrified at a specific time, right? Columbia Heights, when it gentrifies, there's already a history of establishing low equity cooperatives. That's the reason that there's still Ethiopians and Hispanic and African American people in Columbia Heights. They're all in the low equity cooperative, right? There's a reason that there's still roughly 25% of the population in Charlotte that's Black. It's because of those churches that were connected with MICO, the Model Inner City Community Organization, which established church-owned low-income housing. Does 8th Street have any of that history? And is that why it gentrified in the way that it did? I mean, I know that you focused on the main strip, but the neighborhood ended up being part of it.
So we saw, and thank you so much for that, because I think what's important is that cooperative housing, thinking about social housing, having that be a model. When the welfare state ended, there wasn't this emphasis on providing public housing, or at least coming up with more innovative ways to have, spiritual institutions or cultural institutions or whatever to invest in housing. It's as if these kinds of places, these institutions were actually invested in full Black life rather than just thinking about it as housing. It's like the full life, right? And so we don't have that kind of investment now. It's very much cookie cutter, or there's an interest in the investment, or at least housing as an investment. It's the financialization of housing. You make money off of buying. To be a landlord is like a job that you make money off of, right? So with 8th Street, at the end of the 8th Street, we have the Delta Towers, which let's also keep in mind, with affordable housing, it's easier to get senior housing than it is to have families in these housing, right? So in DC, if you build a residential building, you have to have 30% of it be affordable, at a particular percentage of the average median income. The issue though is that also includes senior housing, and so that's a way to get around housing families, is you make it senior housing and it qualifies, right? And so ultimately, you're not necessarily looking at families. You're not looking at expanding kind of Black community. Instead, you're looking at a way to undercut the possibility of making, people live and thrive in the area. So HB didn't have that. There were economic development, there was business and economic development offices, but it was more focused on small business development, not so much as it related to housing. But just this idea of community co-ops, having rent protections, having these opportunities. Again, we often focus on buying property, but renters really matter. And so protecting them, making sure TOPA is something that's strong in these communities is important. So from that end, it's thinking about, again, local politics, the kinds of policies that are passed or legislation that's brought forward, read it. So I have a project going on in Oakland with the Moms for Housing organization, and I'm not even sure if you're familiar with them, but at the end of 2019, they took over an investor-owned house in West Oakland. They were a group of homeless Black mothers with their children, and they just took the house, and they designated it as theirs. And the company that owned it was called Wedgwood. They're a Los Angeles or Redondo Beach-based business. Tried to kick them out. They tried to evict them. They tried to do all the things. Now these women made it beautiful. They turned on the lights. They turned on the gas. They cooked for their families. One of the mothers, her child, walked his first steps. It was really beautiful, right? And so they were strategic, though. They worked with a housing justice organization to figure out the plan. So eventually, the sheriff's office, the county, tried to evict them forcefully. They brought in a tank. They brought in armed police officers, and they removed them from the home. They arrested them in pre-dawn raid and essentially had these huge semi-automatic weapons in front of these babies, and they took them to jail. Ultimately, mind you, the pandemic has at this point started. They won. They were able to buy the home using a community land trust. And so now they have a home in West Oakland called Mom's House. And it's a place where they have for people who are homeless, because 70% of homeless people in Oakland are Black. And I told you earlier, 20% of the population is Black. And so they have this space to cultivate organizing and really thinking about housing justice. So I have a grant with them, or I'm working with them to build an archive of Oakland and to think about Oakland's future. Not only around housing, but just living. They're trying to remediate some toxic space to make it very low income housing development in West Oakland. We're coming up with ideas to have workshops in communities. So that's what I mentioned, to have workshops at the public library. That's what we're having. We're having one in a church where we're teaching them the history of eminent domain. We're asking them, if you didn't have the burden of rent, how would you spend your money? Would you take dance lessons? Would you take an art class? Let's lead policy based on what we want versus the craziness that they're doing in the Capitol, right? And so to be able to have people organized based on that matters so much. And so that's what I'm doing in Oakland. And I'm encouraging you all to host those kinds of things where it's education often matters too, right? People not knowing about this long and important history it's sad, and it's depressing to know that young folks don't know about this and know that that's a possibility. So teaching them about it can help them come up with other strategies and not necessarily listen to, we need AI and I need to be a computer scientist to make money and buy my mama a home. We can think of other strategies to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed the conversation. My name is Matt Hoshi. I was curious, when you came into your field site, what theorists were you thinking of when that brought you to this topic? And also, I'm really kind of inspired by the Black aesthetic in placement, and wondering if you thought about it outside the domains of urban geography and urban sociology. I'm thinking kind of also in domains of tourism or other kind of just very interesting, critical neoliberal spaces.
Yes.
But, yeah.
Thank you for that question, both questions. So theorists, honestly, I was mentioning how I wrote my dissertation. My dissertation wasn't fully on this. It was also on high fashion images. And the reason was because I wanted to put them together because I felt like the way the high fashion industry was looking at Black folks was the same way they were looking at us on the street. So it's kind of like they valued the color of our skin or they valued our bodies, but they didn't actually value us. And so I wanted to pull it together to say it's not only in this kind of like high-end elite space that we're kind of like aestheticizing bodies, but we're also aestheticizing Blackness in spaces. So the book had to be an expansion. I had to add more chapters, of course, to kind of make it a full book. And so in terms of theorists, honestly, like I had to fight against folks who wanted me to talk about philosophers, because that's who talks about aesthetics. But I wanted to talk about bell hooks, and I wanted to talk about June Jordan, and I want to talk about, you know, Du Bois or something instead. And so that's what I did. And rather than talking about a whole bunch of dead white men, I wanted to focus on how bell hooks discusses aesthetics a lot. In fact, she talks about the ways that Black folks supposedly don't have an idea or understanding of aesthetics, but clearly we do, right? And thinking about what is deemed ugly to us is still beautiful. And so how we can understand aesthetics in that way. I was seeing it though, where we had to flip it, where the beauty that we see of Blackness, Black skin ends up being bastardized by them taking it and deciding to make money off of it. And so there's still this aesthetic infrastructure happening, but it's backwards or it's upside down. And we need to account for that because we get excited to see a Black face on TV. We get excited to see a Black mural. We get excited to see Black stuff. But then it's like, wait, they're not doing anything for me though. So they're taking what we've done and then they're making it ugly. And I wanted to be able to recognize that. So yes, I look at it outside of that with tourism as it relates to like cultural tourism DC and like what you use for historic tourism and in DC in particular, but you see it in every avenue. And so that's why I was mentioning earlier with the Black Lives Matter mural. So so talk about getting a call about the mayor's office. Yeah, I'm not a favorite with them. So part of it is because I wrote an op-ed for the Boston Globe about that mural that was put down because it's a form of Black aesthetic emplacement, and I said that. And part of it is it was surface. It was representation without actually representing us. And so they erased the defund the police portion of that, the street mural, claiming that that was a portion of the street that was already gonna be repaved. Give me a break. Like, lie to me. Yeah, like, come on. And so calling out the mayor, but recognizing that her interest again was in economic development and not necessarily in Black lives. She was supporting the expansion of the budget for the police department, and that was the last thing we needed. So to understand that was happening at the same time, it was important for me to connect it to what was happening in the everyday and to still call out Black folks for doing the same thing. So it was that's been kind of my driving force as it relates to where I still see it. But yeah, a number of theorists. There are Black geographers, Catherine McKittrick and some others, Ruthie Gilmore, I was looking at to better understand how race and space interact in the material world, how Black material experience still matters, and how we can see the shift despite looking at a mural, looking at a book, looking at a Coca-Cola with a fist up or whatever, that there's a material element that gets played out when they will purchase that but not have housing for poor Black people. I needed to connect those things.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I cannot say this enough, especially in a Black space that is obviously Black and radically Black. I cannot tell you how much they don't want us to be here. We are Black in place and we are Black. So it's like, what are y'all doing? Why are you here? We don't watch you across the street from the Black school that we're not trying to make Black anymore. It's, oh my God. And the only reason we're here is because they own the building. The only reason we're here. They are trying actively to kick us out every day. Every day. And then, but Black people want to come in here and be like, but why is this book so expensive? or Black people want to come in here wearing something from Walmart that they could have got from us. You know, I'm just, let's talk about it because it's insidious. And it's like, it really makes you think like, wow, they really got us.
Yeah.
They have us so backwards.
Yeah.
We look at each other like, why are you You're supporting a Black business? Oh my God.
So on that note, can I just say this? I know there's a few more questions out there, but we do want to sell books and support Black authors and Black businesses. And for those of you who have bought your books, I know Brandi would certainly love to autograph them, correct? And so please get yourself a drink at the front, grab yourself a book at the counter, come on up here and get it signed. Thank you everyone for coming out. And those of you who still have and would you like to say the last word?
I feel so good. This helped to relax me a little, so thank you for that question. But thank you so much for listening. It's great to come back here to my other home, and to see familiar and new faces, but I'm so appreciative. Thank you so much for the invitation. I thank you so much for sitting here and listening to me, but I really appreciate you all. Thank you.